Bonjour. Ulaku and bonjour. So, I think all of you know I'm Tom Kaity. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist here at CHEO, and I'd like to take this opportunity to have the honor of introducing Amber Miners and Kaity Inookee, who will be presenting grand rounds on a very special today, National Aboriginal Peoples Day. Normally at this point, I should be giving the traditional land acknowledgement. I don't believe in land acknowledgements, so I won't be doing one. I think they've become rote and they've lost their meaning. Indigenous people in Canada often impart information by telling stories. I'd like to honor that tradition by telling a very short story. My first trip to Sandy Lake First Nation for my research took place a couple of years ago. We arrived, and I learned that not only did Sandy Lake have a boil water advisory, which is pretty standard in First Nations communities, but due to underfunding and lack of staff, the entire water system of the community was shut off every evening at 9 p.m. and turned back on at 9 a.m. And I'd like you to picture, you want to go to work, you can't have a shower in the morning, you can't have a shower after 9 p.m. And in fact, you can't actually flush your toilet after 9 p.m. And try and think how long that would be considered acceptable in Ottawa or Peterborough or Trois-Rivières. But in Sandy Lake, that's the way it is. So if you're wondering whether institutional and structural racism is still alive and well in Canada, I'd suggest you visit Sandy Lake. So I'd now like to introduce our two speakers this morning. Kaity Inookee is an Inuit beneficiary born and living in Iqaluit for the last 17 years. She's a graduate of the University of Manitoba, working as a part-time counselor, and has taken the role as the program director at Umingmak Center, which aids in the overall functioning and oversees the programming. Her passion is to advocate for children, youth, and families affected by abuse, and continue to help those who are in her community on their healing journey. Her favorite things to do outside of work are dog sledding, running, camping on the Nunavut, and hanging out with her dog. Dr. Amber Miners is a consultant pediatrician in Iqaluit who's been living in Iqaluit for the last 14 years. She's a graduate of Queen's and also from CHEO, yay! And holds faculty positions at the University of Ottawa and at Memorial. She's completed extra training in child abuse, and this has become her passion. She's currently the physician lead at the Umingmak Child Advocacy Center and is the proud mom of 4 children. So welcome, and let me turn things over to the two of you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. We're thrilled and honored to be able to present to you today, and especially on Indigenous Peoples Day. We kind of have a lot packed in, so because when you give a topic like this, we could talk for hours. So we'll try and fit it all in, and hopefully leave some room for discussion and questions after. And we're I'm a bit Zoom naive, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and then just because of our bandwidth, I'll probably turn off the camera for most of the presentation, then turn us back on after. But and I can't see the chat, so if there's things that can't wait till the end, feel free to speak up. So there we are. So we're going to talk healing through connection. Oops, there we go. We have no disclosures. The objectives really are to briefly review the history of Inuit in Canada, to talk about the health and economic status of Inuit, and hopefully, like you coming from CHEO, a lot of you have a lot of this information as well, but hopefully there'll be something new and interesting that comes out of this talk. And then to talk about the Umingmak Center, where we both work, which we're really sort of proud of, a model of care for children after disclosure of abuse here in Iqaluit, Nunavut. And we are, again, presenting from Iqaluit, which is Inuit land.
So we're going to begin with just a little bit of the Inuit journey and how we got here. We'll talk about some of the things of where we came from, as well as how our past experience have affected us today, and then where do we kind of go from here. So I'm going to start off with this graph. So this graph shows the value of independence and control that the Inuit had. So the Inuit have experienced many changes throughout the last 100 years, and even before that. Some of the changes were chosen by Inuit, and then a lot of them have not been chosen by Inuit. But we have been quite resilient, and we've taken advantage of a lot of the opportunities. And then moving forward, we've also experienced a lot of control and security, and these changes caused a lot of problems in our society. So, so this is pre-contact. So before we were in contact with non-Inuit, we lived in a thriving, holistic society. And by that, we mean that we lived in camps. There were several different families in the camps. We lived off the land. We hunted, fished for survival. And then we were sharing all of our food and all of our catches with one another. So a big part of Inuit tradition is that we use the whole animal. So we never let any type of resource go to waste. And so this picture is just goes to show how much one animal can do many other things. It's not just for the meat. The fur is used for the tents, for hunting, for sleeping. As you can see, like, you can use them for boots, you can use them for different items of clothing, for the dogs. Many different things went into using for the one animal. So that was really important, and it's also a tradition that we try to keep alive today as well. So the 4 waves of non-Inuit. So the first wave of non-Inuit that were contacted by Inuit were the explorers. So the explorers, they continued to look for the Northwest Passage until the early 1900s. So explorers came quite often. The big thing about the explorers were that they were map makers. And so it made it a lot easier for them to return to the Arctic, and they were able to share their stories with other people, and they were able to show how they got to the Arctic and how they passed through. And so that also gave them a chance to return along with many others. Next were the whalers in the 1800s. So the whalers came from Britain, Scotland, and the US. The products like whale bones and whale oil were in high demand. So they came pretty much every year, and they had a big impact on Inuit life. They drew on Inuit knowledge. They employed and traded with Inuit, and they introduced regular trade, entertainment, and social relationships. So they were a big part of, their connection was a big part of when they came to the Arctic. So next was the missionaries. So the missionaries came to the Arctic to spread the word of God. Previously, Inuit had already had the religion of Anglican, and so this kind of caused tension within the camps. The biggest thing with the missionaries is that they introduced the writing system, the Inuktitut writing system of to Inuit, because we didn't have one before. So missionaries were able to translate the Bible to Inuktitut, and that was a big thing for the Inuits. And so they made sure that the beliefs of God were, and any previous beliefs were such as like shamanism, drum dancing, throat singing, they were all banished because they considered it the work of the devil. And then last thing about the missionaries is that Inuit were so reliant on the seasons, they didn't have a concept of time. And so for Sundays, because Sundays are typically a day of rest, you go to church, they had no concept of this. And this was something that the missionaries enforced. And so this was very new to them and, caused tensions in the camps. And then lastly, the traders, so which was in the early 1900s. The first Hudson's Bay Company trading post was established in Kimmeroot. So Kimmeroot is actually our closest community from to Iqaluit here. And the impacts of the traders were that instead of Inuit sharing their catch, living off the land, they started hunting for trade and not just for food. So this became more individualistic for the Inuit. And this was actually the beginning of the economy for the Inuit. So the government era. Just going to touch on this quickly, but so the government era, like I said, the Inuit were living in a pretty traditional society. And so a lot of the systems that were in place, they looked to their leaders, their elders, their hunters for support. And when making any decisions, those were the people that made those big decisions. So in the early 1900s, RCMP first went up the north for threats of Canadian sovereignty. So they started traveling to communities to enforce the Canadian law. This was very confusing for them because they had no idea about the Canadian justice system. This was more so like enforcing laws in terms of punishment, which was never something that, Inuit ever had to deal with or ever had to do. So the relocation. So as you can see on this photo, you can see that so during the Cold War, many of the countries fought for like taking over or to claim the North. Lower Canada, they had sent military to claim the land. And so they believed that if the federal government put Inuit in different areas, they would consider it to be Canada's land because it had Canadian Aboriginals or Indigenous people there in different places. So Inuit were brought to higher places. They were brought to Grise Fiord, which is our highest community in Nunavut, and to see if they can pretty much survive. So they were left there. So lower mainland Inuit were brought from places like Churchill, Coral Harbor, Cape Dorset, all the way up to like the high north. And the higher you go, pretty much is the more extreme conditions that it is. And so they suffered a lot of hardship due to not understanding the weather, not understanding how to hunt and survive up there. And so it was very difficult for them. And they did survive. A lot of them did, but only barely. So this brings us to TB in the North. So between the 1940s and 1960s, during this time, there were a lot of sicknesses going around, one of them being tuberculosis. So around 1946, thousands of Inuit across the North suffered from an outbreak of tuberculosis. The Coast Guard set up ship along the coast to screen Inuit in the North for TB. So if they found that there was any types of sickness, they found that they were showing any symptoms, they were not allowed to get off the ship. And so this caused, children, babies, family members to be taken away from their family. And unfortunately, a lot of those people and children did not return. So at one point, 1 in 7 Inuit were being treated for tuberculosis during this time in the South. So this brings us to the education piece. So as I said before, there was no writing system besides, the Bible being translated into Inuktitut. So we often taught our children morals and values through legends and stories. And so when residential schools opened up in the South, they opened up in the 1860s. As most of us know, they were put in place they were religious schools put in place to take the Indian out of the child, or the Indigenous out of the child. So in 1948, residential schools started for Inuit in places like Churchill, Manitoba, Fort Smith, and then Chesterfield Inlet was our first one in Nunavut. If they refused to let their child attend these schools, parents, they would not get a family allowance. So at that time, that was really their only source of income. So they felt obligated to obviously send their kids to these schools. And as we know from, the graves that have been dug up, a lot of those children did not return from those schools as well. So at the schools, we know that the children were often physically and mentally abused, and they were not allowed to speak Inuktitut or their Indigenous languages. So by 1963, 3,997, almost 4,000 Inuit children were enrolled in residential schools. And it's of note that the last school in Nunavut closed in 1996. So through the 1950s, 1960s, the Canadian government began to build settlements. So just before that, they were smaller communities or settlements. They often had different families living in the same place. But the government of Canada believed that permanent settlements would allow easier access to essential services, school, social services, healthcare, programming, things like this. As we know, that housing costs began to rise at this time, and housing is still incredibly expensive in the north, and so it was incredibly difficult for Inuit to have their own home, and most of them lived in tents. So you can kind of see in the one photo that there are bigger tents for different families there. And then the new communities were run by government officials. So there were a lot of changes, a lot of trauma, but and time again we felt that the government tried to ban our culture and find ways to not promote our culture, and so we continue to manage to revive it and try to grow and expand in different ways. We tried to be as involved in our country's government as much as possible, and we put an emphasis on passing down cultural traditions, throat singing, dog sledding. You might have seen younger Inuit. There's been a resurgence of traditional tattoos, not so much here in Inookee, but in higher up communities. And then also just the continued diet of country food, or living off the land, and hunting and fishing practices that we try to promote. And with every year, we have more youth who are interested in reviving our culture. So in 1999, creation of Nunavut. April 1st, 1999 is when we became our own territory. And then Iqaluit, where both Amber and I live, was chosen to be the capital. So again, the fight to keep our culture alive, it's still very real today, and we try to pass down these traditions and cultural practices as much as we can. The continued changes in our communities and trauma that's been imposed on our people and our communities continues to be passed down through generations. So Amber is going to continue with just trauma and types of traumatic experiences.
So to switch gears a little bit, but staying on the same vein, we're going to talk about trauma. So basically a traumatic event can be a single traumatic experience or repeated events that completely overwhelm an individual's ability to cope. So many different experiences can cause trauma, and they fall into different categories, and this is one way of categorizing them. But a lot of times these categories overlap, and it can result in a layering effect. So there's like, the interpersonal or, developmental traumas, like child abuse being the big one. But if you layer them on top of historical and intergenerational traumas, like we just talked about, and trauma doesn't just happen here, it happens all over the world. And the reason that we have, we'll get into such high rates here, is the historical intergenerational trauma that we talked about on the downward curve of that Inuit power curve. So in Inuktitut, historical or intergenerational traumas translated to be trauma experienced by generations past, having an effect on their descendants. And it's cumulative and it's intergenerational, and it means that the accumulated effects are passed on from one generation to the next. So the trauma experienced firsthand by Inuit during these government eras had a huge impact on all the following generations. And many Inuit from that era were just not able to properly heal. And this unresolved trauma compromises the ability to cope with stress in a healthy manner. So all these different sources of trauma coming from outside Indigenous communities basically generate a huge range of dysfunctional and hurtful behaviors. So we see physical and sexual abuse, for example, which seems to be recycled generation after generation within the community. So our current state of child maltreatment here in Nunavut. So we know that child maltreatment and child abuse is not uncommon, but here, unfortunately, our rates are 10 times the rate of other Canadian children. Our last big Inuit health survey showed that over half of Inuit women and almost a quarter of Inuit men have reported having experienced just severe childhood sexual abuse. And we know also that these rates are likely higher as many incidences are not reported. And adverse childhood experiences. And I hope that everyone here, this is well ingrained into your brain by now, but just a reminder that what adverse childhood experiences and their effects. So we know that adverse childhood experiences are very common. Majority of people will have one, most will have more than one. These occur in every jurisdiction in every country all around the world, but the impacts are variable. And it really depends on the situation, the resiliency, supports, and all those layerings of trauma that we talked about. And we know that ACEs lead to, so the more ACEs you have, and the more layering of trauma that you have, the more likely you are to have these very physical and mental health outcomes. All these things that we used to think were due to genetics or poor health behavior, like ischemic heart disease and cancers, now we know are directly linked to these childhood experiences. And the more studies we do, the more times we go through it, the more it becomes more and more clear. And suicide attempt is one in particular we're going to talk about. So if you have an ACE score of 7 or more, you're increasing your likelihood of child and adolescent suicide attempts 51-fold and adult suicide attempts by 30-fold. And this is, the p-values show it's very statistically significant, and it, intuitively makes sense if you've got a lot of childhood trauma and not a lot of supports systemically, your mental health is going to suffer, and we see it. So here in Nunavut, we have a suicide crisis, and we have had for some time, and it has not, if you're a graph type person, it's getting it, the graph doesn't look very reassuring. So on the I don't know what side of the screen, this side that you can't see where I'm pointing, the gray bar at the bottom is the total Canada of suicide, and the light blue in the middle is Nunavut, and we're sort of second behind Nunavut right now. And those are the four, this is Inuit Journey. These are the four regions where the vast majority of Inuit live across Canada. So it is a problem. And we talk about, and this is an infographic from ITK, which is the Inuit organization for all of Inuit Nunavut, not just Nunavut. But we talk about the risk factors and the protective factors for suicide and for trauma in general, but this one specifically for suicide. So talking about not just the acute stress or loss, but also the historical trauma, the intergenerational trauma, the community distress, the wounded family, all those things are really important. And then also to remember that there's protective factors. Cultural continuity is a huge one, right? Connection to culture, to language, to the land. Social equity is another huge one. Family strength, healthy development. So these are the things we need to sort of start focusing on, is the protective factors. And hopefully, if you've heard about ACEs, hopefully you also heard about positive. So there's the adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences. So having an ACE or having a high ACE score is just a screen. It doesn't mean it's a death sentence, right? We know that there's so many other factors that affect how you can deal with adverse childhood experiences and historical traumas. And really we need to focus on building the resilience. And then having supportive networks around children and giving them the resiliency and the support they need. And then when ACEs happen, because we know they will happen, unfortunately, responding optimally. So having trauma-informed services and care, and having culturally appropriate care and connection with language and culture really can't be underestimated. And this is another, although it's a bit ironic, we live above the tree line, but it is a really nice way of thinking about the pair of ACEs. So there's the adverse childhood experiences on the top, which are like the tree, but then the adverse community environments as well. So the roots of the tree, the stability, the foundation. So these are the things that make that layering and additive effect. So if you have adverse community environments like poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, poor housing, like Dr. Kovesi mentioned, the water, if you don't have running water, then when these other adverse childhood experiences happen, the foundation isn't there and the effects are much larger. So the other inequities. So, we can't really move forward until we address the inequities. And this is another infographic again from ITK, just comparing the living status of Inuit living on Inuit land, Inuit Nunavut, versus the rest of Canada. So 39% of Inuit in Inuit Nunavut live in crowded homes compared to 4% of other Canadians. 70% of Inuit households do not have enough to eat. 7 out of 10 households, 7 out of 10 children that you see are not going to have enough to eat, compared to 8.3% of the rest of Canada. Physician access, so 30 per 100,000 compared to 119 per 100,000 in the South. And our life expectancy is a full 10 years less. So, not acceptable numbers. And then we get to move on to sort of the positivity and what we can do. One example of what we can do moving forward.
Yes. So the Umingmak Child and Youth Advocacy Center, both Amber and I are so happy and grateful to work at. So it's a center to help children, youth, and their families heal from experiences of abuse in Nunavut. So the idea was that, a concerned group of individuals, they came forward. They were community members, they were service providers, and they pretty much said that we're not doing enough to help heal our community when they are, experiencing abuse. So this task force, which included RCMP, teachers, pediatricians, lawyers, etc., they did what they could in their own service provisions, but they felt that, you know, another service was needed. So the model that the group thought would address these issues were one of a child advocacy center. So.
And I want to mention too the logo of the Umingmak. So Umingmak is a muskox in Inuit, and when they sense fear or there's danger, they put the child muskox Umingmak in the middle and make a circle around them, which is a nice way of thinking about it.
So the Umingmak Center was formed in 2019, and we are under the Arctic Child and Youth Foundation, which is a Canadian charity and nonprofit. It was created in 2003 by the Honorable Mary Simon, Landon B. Pearson, Susan Uglukuk, and others. They recognized that children and youth in Nunavut were facing a crisis in identity, and that they wanted the same access to services and, you know, healing opportunities as Southern Canadians. So under Arctic and Child and Youth Foundation, we have two main programs, the Umingmak Center, and then we also have the Inuit Child First Initiative Coordination Office, which, you know, coordinates for Jordan's principal. So this is some of the staff at Umingmak. Actually, this is a lot of the staff that works at ACYF. So currently we have 2 advocates, 2 counselors, a clinical director. We are just bringing on a family resource worker this month. We currently have a summer student, and then we also have an executive director that oversees the programming through ACYF. And currently we have 75% of our staff are Inuit. We work for Inuit. And so we make it a priority to employ Inuit, as we feel that it's super important to have trauma-informed and culturally based treatment options for the Inuit population. Yeah. So what do we do? So Child and Youth Advocacy Center. The idea is, so when we receive a referral from one of our community partners, whether it be a pediatrician, a teacher, we often get referrals from the RCMP. We have a forensic interview. We can also hold the forensic interview here. So the special investigative team will come here in plain clothes, and they will have the forensic interview in one of our offices. We also are able to, I'm not sure if you guys saw before, but we have a pediatric exam or pediatric room in the office. So we're able to have sexual assault kits, reassurance exams done here, and Amber does most of those. And then all under one roof, we also have you know, the healing services, or so that's what we have the advocates for, and then we also have counselors. So this photos just goes to show just how many times, you know, a child, when they experience abuse, how many times they have to, you know, tell their story. So on average, they have to tell their story 7 to 10 times. Starts at where they first disclose, and then you have to tell the police, you have to tell the, you know, doctor, you have to tell you know, a teacher, you have to tell a lawyer, like a counselor. There's so many different places that you have to go in order to receive the care. And so the idea of a Child and Youth Advocacy Center is that you only have to tell it a few times under the one roof. And so having all the services under one roof, it's easier for the child to begin their you know, healing journey, and they're able to, you know, feel safe and comfortable in one place instead of having to go to, you know, the emergency department to get a sexual assault kit done, which is already quite invasive. Then they have to go to the police station. Like, it's too much. And so being able to do that all under one roof is incredibly important. So the Umingmak Center, these are just some of our community partners that we've kind of talked about. So we work closely with family services, justice, education, health. We work with the RCMP. They do our forensic interviews. And then we also work with Nunavut Suicide in terms of policies.
So last few slides, so we'll have a few minutes for questions too. So I'm also getting texted about possibly doing a kit this morning. So, you know, there's no shortage of clients. So the benefits really are in the literature, well documented, well known at this point. Basically, we can provide better services, better access to services. It saves money, which is a big help when you're asking for money. And really the most important thing is it decreases the impact of these ACEs on the children and helps them work through the trauma more efficiently, effectively, and be healthier in the long term. For us, we were really lucky, you know, this work falls into a lot of joint priorities. So the MMIW, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, actually one of the recommendations, 16.39, specifically names us. We call upon governments to support and fund the establishment of culturally appropriate and effective child advocacy centers like the Umingmak Center. The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, number 21, also states we call upon the federal government to provide sustainable funding for existing and new Aboriginal healing centers to address the physical and spiritual harms caused by residential schools and to ensure the funding of healing centers in Nunavut and NWT. The GN, the Government of Nunavut business cases, were specifically named in the Nunavut Child Abuse and Neglect Response Agreement, and also, you know, what we're working on is commented on in the Office of the Auditor General report. So, our center data. So we chose the worst time to open just before COVID, but basically that's the way the chips fell. And we, given the data we had with the feasibility study and our business case, we kind of anticipated 50 referrals a year just for Iqaluit. We got 84 in the first year, even despite COVID. And then the second year, 107 with over 600 therapy sessions. So we're on a really upward curve. Our data for this last third year is just being worked on now, but it's even higher. And our clientele are 98% Inuit, which is great. That's the goal. The pediatric clinic at the Umingmak Center, basically, it's a fully functional pediatric clinic. So we can do the forensic kits, which are on site. We have forensic photos. We have our own secure database, reassurance and follow-up exams. We can do all the blood work and urine here. So we actually can take blood here if the child doesn't want. It's supposed to be a one-stop shop as much as possible. So we have an agreement with our hospital lab, so we can draw the blood and take the urine here and just walk them over to the hospital. We have emergency contraception and STI treatment here on site. And then we get to do a variety of other things. We get to do education, case reviews, working with other organizations. We have the group home through our child welfare organization, and a lot of them are, hard to engage. So, I'll go out to the group home and do visits there if needed. So really, in summary, the history of Inuit and all Indigenous people in Canada is troubling, but Inuit are, and we see over and over again, they're incredibly resilient. Intergenerational trauma has a very real and devastating effects that we still see every day, but it is so important to have culturally and linguistically applicable or appropriate services, especially after trauma and child maltreatment, because of these layers upon layers upon layers that exist. And today's reconciliation starts with our children, and really all of us need to be involved. And if trauma can be inherited from one generation to the next, then so can love, resilience, and wisdom. Those are our contact and we do have a website, but it is under construction currently, but it will be, and I spelled construction wrong too, but it will be available shortly. And that hopefully gives us a few minutes for questions, comments, or things of that nature. So I will figure out how to stop sharing, and then if anyone has any questions, I don't know if I can see the chat or comments.
So Amber and Kaity Nachome, Chimigwech, thank you so much. Merci for a wonderful presentation and for your incredible work. There's so much hurt and there's so much pain in Nunavut, and the work you do is so important in dealing with that. And you're right. I don't know if you can see the print behind me in my house, which is a wonderful print from Pangnirtung, and just points out how much beauty there is in Nunavut as well. So let me open things up to questions. So Toby, please go ahead.
Well, congratulations. And I can say, having sort of seen from the outside, watching some of this get built, amazing work. And I think, when you present it as something that's already up and running, it doesn't represent the many, many, many hours and the number of people and all the challenging conversations to get there. So congratulations. I guess my question for you would be, what next? If I had a magic wand and I had $1 million to give you, what do you think you and your partners in the clinic, what would you spend it on? Like, where would you take this if you had this magical unlimited resources? What do you see as the next steps? You've got a great spot to kind of assess the kids and try and get them to treatment and support, but obviously there's so much more to this than that. Maybe that's an unfair question, but I'm going to ask anyways.
That's a great question. Do you want to answer? You want me to? we talk about this all the time.
Yeah. And I said 1 million, but maybe it needs to be 1 billion. I don't. Things are expensive.
A lot. Well, so it's not for profit, right? So funding's a big issue. So right now we're currently only able to serve Inuit, right? So getting out to the communities has been like a real desire for us. We did throw an idea out and ask for funding to do like a mobile team. To actually, when something happens, we send a team out, with a healthcare provider, a trauma counselor type person and an RCMP. So you could do the forensic piece, but then also sort of do on the ground training, train the trainer, get the people who are going to be on the ground with that family and that child, give them some, network, some scaffolding and some supports to get them going, and then do sort of distance support after that. So you don't have to remove, because a lot of times now a child is removed from the community, right, for either forensic or for, child welfare reasons or medical reasons. And it's, not always, like, that's often a layer of trauma on top of it. So not always the best for the child and family, but yeah, we'd love to.
Yeah, I actually, if nobody else has a question, that was one of the things when I was going up north that I used to struggle with in Clyde River, was, when things were reported, is the right thing to take somebody completely out of the community or not, because of the piece that you had said, Amber, about in some instances separating them also from all of their, it would mean separating them from all of their supports, because in the household they may have an aggressor or somebody, but at the same time that's also potentially in the same household where their supportive network is. And in the small communities, because you'd said because of the housing, there's not a lot of physical spaces that, for example, the mother and child could go to elsewhere without leaving the other kid behind, or like, it's very complicated. So yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that decision of like, when do you decide that the person should come out of the situation, and pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, I know in some places there is the justice system actually, or you can remove the perpetrator from the home as opposed to removing the child. And then there's the, wouldn't that be nice to have therapy and support within the home when that perpetrator has been removed, and that perpetrator get whatever supports or, that person needs. But yeah, pie in the sky. I mean, we struggle a lot, as you probably know, right? Just with high turnover. So we have sort of an education program and like a training and having people on the ground have, basic skills and trauma informed and all that, but then they leave. So it's like this wheelhouse. So we're trying to shift to like a hub of expertise and support here, and then yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if you want other thoughts, but we have these conversations all the time. These are great questions. we welcome ideas, and yeah, or if you know anyone who's rich that wants to help support us, we'd love to talk to them too.
Maybe I'll just follow up on that. So typically after your evaluations, do most kids go back to the communities, or what typically happens?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't currently have funding to bring people in to our community. So if they were here, either because they brought in by medical or another service, and they happen to be here, we can give them all their supports. And then when they go back, it's really the people on the ground in that community that are supporting that child and family. So mental health worker in the health center, education, social worker, nurses.
So there's lots of questions. Maybe I'll start with Marita Smith.
Yeah.
Hi. So I work with the sexual assault care program here at CHEO. So first of all, I see all of the unsaid work and challenges behind everything that you've just shown us, and it's amazing. Two sort of questions. One is, what kind of supports do you have in terms of peer review and sort of mentorship for when you have challenging cases that you sort of need some support with outside of your own, or does that come up, or do you feel well supported? And then the second one is, we're sort of in a similar position to you, where we're rebuilding and trying to build forward and look into the future. And so I just wondered if you had, we would love to have a CYAC here in Ottawa. We don't currently. So if you have any thoughts or advice on how we can move ourselves forward towards that, I would love to hear it.
Yes, we have lots of doing. Talk about health, or yeah.
So yeah, so the
Yeah.
first, just to the first question, so we do have consulting, or several different people that we look to for advice or support when we're kind of in that stuck position. So one of them is Dr. Susan Dundas. She's a consulting psychiatrist. She works for Sick Kids in Toronto. I'm sure you know of her, and she's wonderful. We also have a consulting organization that we look to for support, which is Radius Child and Youth Services. They're also in Toronto or the GTA. They specialize in problematic sexual behavior. And then we also just, we have lots of resources here in town. Amber is a great resource for just anything on the ground, and really looking to our team for support as well.
And then medically, as you know, because we do our peer review every month on the medical side with your team, the Child Youth and Protection team. Yeah, so we call you for the medical stuff. And then the how to build a CYC. I mean, we're lucky in some ways here because we have one child welfare system organization. We have one police system, RCMP, and one health system across the territory. So in that way, it wasn't easier, but probably simpler. But there's like the National Child Advocacy Center. I don't know if you're involved in that, but anyway, we could probably take that offline, and I have lots of ideas and thoughts, but yeah, because there is a national,
I have your email. I'll follow up.
Yeah, happy to chat. Yeah,
There's a real quick question from Christina Quentin, who'd like to know about the logo for your center.
oh yeah.
So
Okay,
we kind of briefly went over it, but so the logo is, I don't know if you can share the screen again, but it is a picture of a all the way at the bottom here.
We're done.
So right here, it is it's
Umingmak. Muskox.
Muskox. I always say bison for some reason, but
Oops,
they're
sorry.
all very big animals. And so the idea is when you know, a baby muskox is hurt or, you know, being hunted by other land animals, the older muskox or the bigger ones, they kind of rally around each other. And so when we kind of found out this information, I think that's where our logo was created, just to show that you know, that's what we kind of do at Child and Youth Advocacy Centers is, you know, we rally around the children or the babies. So that's our logo.
And lots of the other, we're the 26th in Canada, so there, many of them are named after different animals, like the sea star in Halifax and the zebra. So that's, we picked an animal.
Dr. Lee Fraser Roberts had her hand up. I don't know if she's still.
Oh, hi, Tom. I was just about to leave because I have to scoot out, so I typed something in the chat, but I will quickly say thank you so much, Kajanomik, for a wonderful presentation. Kaity, in particular, I think the historical context is always refreshing to hear in terms of education for those people who, you know, all of us benefit every time we hear it, just as a reminder. For those of you who don't know, I'm a pediatrician who's worked in Nunavut for more than 20 years now. And as Amber knows, I go to Baker Lake and to Coral Harbor and reach out when I need to with situations for advice. And I would love to see the mobile outreach team. I think that would be a fabulous service because I think all children and eligible children and youth in Nunavut should be receiving this service. One quick question I had is whether or not your center is involved in prevention and education in the communities on a broader level.
Yeah, I think upon request. So right now we, you know, we do presentations with the schools. We work closely with the guidance counselors at the schools. You know, in justice, we are home to, this year will be the third trauma symposium that we put on alongside of with the mental health team and then also with Radius. So we bring over 100 different professionals together to talk about trauma and how we can move forward in our communities. And so that's like a big thing that we do every year. It'll be held in October, which is really exciting. And again, it's touching on that culturally relevant practice that we can bring to our communities. And it's not just here in Inuit, it's in, you know, in all 26 communities that we have.
Community practice.
Community of practice. So we do have a community of practice with just one here in Inuit, and then also I know that mental health has one for the other communities as well. And so we get together with family services, mental health, education, justice, all of our community partners, and we just talk about you know, cases because we have an MOU with the government in Nunavut. We're able to share that information with one another and you know, just try to work the best way that we can together. And so that's really important for us as well to make those connections in our community.
And to not feel alone doing the work that we're doing, right? It's better together. And everything's a little bit different in the north. So we're, you know, nothing from, like, you can't take a southern model and just plop it here. It's always a bit, you know, which is part of the fun. We get to make it our own. Yeah.
So any other questions? So I can tell you that there are lots and lots of positive comments in the chat about the presentation, about talking about the historical context. So if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank both of our speakers again for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask everyone to take a few moments out of your busy day today and think about National Aboriginal Peoples Day and what we can all do to facilitate national reconciliation. And of course, please fill out your evaluations. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for including us today. Very exciting.